Okay, good afternoon. I'm Kevin Vance. I direct the Center for Constitutional Liberty here at Benedictine College. And happy Constitution Day vigil to everyone. And also the vigil of St. Robert Bellarmine tomorrow. Also a significant figure for us. I'd like to thank the librarians for being here and also to congratulate them on their 60th anniversary as a federal depository library. So congratulations. And thank you for the cupcakes. And also would like to thank the Jack Miller Center for sponsoring today's Constitution Day talk. And I just want to thank them for their continued partnership. Our next event will be October 30th. James Stoner from Louisiana State University will be giving a talk on kicking off a series on the Declaration of Independence as we prepare for the semi-quincentennial. And I'm going to introduce one of our constitutional fellows who will introduce our speaker. Lucia Smith is a senior from Minnesota. Her majors are international studies and political science. She's a French minor. She's a Gregorian fellow, a constitutional fellow, a varsity women's soccer player, and a missions ambassador. And this past summer, she participated in the Koch internship program and interned with the American Legislative Exchange Council, America's largest nonpartisan voluntary membership organization of state legislators dedicated to the principles of limited government, free markets, and federalism. Thanks, Lucia.
Richard W. Garnett is the Paul J. Sherrill Professor of Law and Concurrent Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He teaches and writes about the freedoms of speech, association, and religion, and about constitutional law more generally. He is a leading authority on questions and debates regarding church-state relations and the role of religious believers and beliefs in society. He has published widely on these matters and the author of dozens of law review articles and book chapters and the co-author of 3 books. Professor Garnett is regularly invited to share analysis and commentary in national print and broadcast media, and he contributes to several law-related blogs, including Mirror of Justice and Pross Blog. He is the founding director of Notre Dame Law School's program on church, state, and society, an interdisciplinary project that focuses on the role of religious institutions, communities, and authorities in the social order. He served on the Notre Dame Task Force on Catholic Education, is a fellow of the university's Institute for Educational Initiatives, and consults regularly with the Alliance for Catholic Education. He is a member of the American Law Institute and the American Academy of Sciences and Letters. Professor Garnett clerked for the late Chief Justice of the United States, William H. Rehnquist, during the court's 1996 term, and also for the State Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit, Richard S. Arnold. He earned his J.D. from Yale Law School in 1995 and his B.A. summa cum laude from Duke University in 1990. He joined the faculty in 1999 after practicing law in Washington, D.C. with Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin. He and his wife, Professor Nicole Stell Garnett, live in South Bend, Indiana, and have 4 children. Please join me in welcoming Richard W. Garnett.
After hearing your qualifications, Lucia, I really think that you should be the one giving this lecture rather than me. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you. I'm a big fan of this institution, big fan of Kansas. I married a Kansan. I was married in Kansas, and like all smart people, I think Kansas City barbecue is the best in the country. So the title of this short-ish talk is Religion and the American Constitutional Experiment. It's also the name of this book that would make a really nice gift for anybody who you want to be a real geek and give a Constitution Day present to. It's on Amazon and it's by me, and there you go, they'd love it. But religion and the American Constitutional Experiment. So I'm talking about 2 of the things that we're always told to never talk about in bars, on airplanes, or at Thanksgiving with that uncle. You know, religion and politics. That's what I'm talking about. And what's the connection between religion and Constitution Day? Why is my book called Religion and the American Constitutional Experiment? So as I know a lot of you are learning, and if you haven't yet, you will, some of the distinctive features of America's Constitution are the way that we allocated, divided, separated and constrained power. A lot of times, our fellow citizens, when you ask them about the Constitution, their first thought is about, and this is not a bad thing, the Bill of Rights, right? Rights that are listed, rights that are guaranteed to us. And again, big fan of rights here. Don't hear me saying otherwise. But the real important thing about our Constitution, I think in many ways the kind of original political theory contribution of our Constitution, was this insight that listing rights isn't enough to protect them. What you need is to provide the extra safeguard of structuring the government in such a way that it's harder for the government to violate your rights. So as you know, I'm sure, our Constitution does that in various ways. Right? We separated the powers of the federal government among the three branches. And now there seems to be a mysterious fourth branch that we don't like to talk about, but it's out there somewhere. We separated powers between the national government and the states, right? We really thought that our federal system would create a system of competing and divided loyalties, and that would have the salutary effect of each layer of government checking the other and thereby protecting freedoms like the freedom of religion. But here's another way in which our constitutional experiment divided and structured power in such a way that facilitates freedom. And that is that our Constitution, unlike most that had gone before, guaranteed the freedom of religion. And it protected it in two complementary ways. And I want you to really think about that word complementary. Sometimes when we talk about freedom of religion in America, people will say something like, well, our First Amendment protects the free exercise of religion. That's the pro-religion part. But then it has this anti-establishment clause. That's the anti-religion part. That's not right, okay? Our separation of church and state, I'll be talking about that concept a little later, but our separation is not an anti-religious separation. It wasn't a separation born of hostility. It was rather, like federalism and like the separation of powers, it was an affirmation that the power of political authorities couldn't extend into the church or the churches. I'll develop that more in a minute. So here's what I want to do in the time that we have. I got kind of four steps in addition to all that intro stuff I was just saying. First, I want to talk kind of at a high level of generality about some first principles of religious freedom. These are my priors. You might think of them as my biases. But since I'm right about them, they're not biased, are they? The second thing I want to do is say three ridiculously superficial things about the history of the West that will set up America's constitutional experiment. The third thing I want to do is take my entire First Amendment Religious Freedom Law School class and condense it for you down into about 10 minutes. So you'll be really getting your money's worth there. And then I want to end with what I see as some kind of challenges that we face to religious freedom in the United States today. So where do I start? First principles. Religious freedom is a fundamental human right. This is true in American constitutional law. It's true in the international human rights law. It's identified as such in the European Convention on Human Rights and the United Nations Declaration. The key thing to appreciate, and the key thing for governments to appreciate, is that religious freedom, it matters. It's not that it matters, what's the right way to put this? It doesn't matter because the Constitution protects it. Rather, the Constitution protects religious freedom because we recognized how much religious freedom matters. Religious freedom is not a gift or a concession from the government. It is, like I was saying earlier, a limit or a constraint on government. It's a recognition by government that its own powers are limited. It's such a crucial affirmation. As I see it, every person, precisely because he or she is a person, has the right to religious liberty. This is the key moral anthropology at the heart of the Declaration on Religious Freedom that came out of the Second Vatican Council. It's the key to St. Pope John Paul II's teaching on religious freedom, that religious freedom is a feature of our humanity, right? That we have it as persons. We all have a stake in religious freedom, whether we are religious or not. Religious freedom can sometimes be messy. It can be inconvenient for governments. It can get in the way of some projects. It can require us to tolerate some things that we think are kind of strange or even worse. But it's worth it. We wisely distinguish between religious and political authority. At least I believe that decision was wise. That's what separation, properly understood, means. But remember, just because we separate religious and political authority, it doesn't mean, and I know some people have an incorrect view about this, it doesn't mean that there's no room for religion in public life. It doesn't mean that faith should be absent from the public square. It doesn't mean that our governments can't recognize religious dimensions of our history and culture. And it doesn't mean that religious institutions and governments can't cooperate to promote the common good. Schools, hospitals, social welfare agencies, and so on. Now, the project of protecting religious freedom in law is not always straightforward, especially in a pluralistic society, right? Religious freedom is easy when everyone agrees. It gets a little trickier when you don't. But there's going to be trade-offs, there's going to be balancing, but it's still, my view is, it's still worth undertaking this experiment. So a mentor of mine, a great law teacher at Emory named John Whitty, likes to say that the American experiment in religious freedom is, his words, in place, so it's here, but it's also in progress. And he borrows a line from James Madison, Constitution Day, father of our Constitution, yay, Madison shout out, the first of many, no doubt, that it was our commitment to religious freedom that Madison thought would give a distinct, his words, luster to our country. He was pretty psyched about federalism and separation of powers, but what he thought was really going to capture the attention of the world was our commitment to religious freedom. It's worth reflecting on whether we still believe that today. So I mean all that to be kind of big picture framing stuff. With that in place, I want to say, again, 3 ridiculously superficial things about world history and about our constitutional experiment. So the first thing, and at Benedictine you guys probably learned this thanks to Dr. Vance's program, but a lot of times students don't know this. The American experiment in religious freedom is older than James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. There's sometimes this idea that no one was thinking about religious freedom until Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were writing letters, and James Madison was mad about Patrick Henry's proposal to pay for chaplains' education and so on. That's not right. It goes way back. If we want to understand the history of America's experiment in religious freedom, we need to think not only about our founding, not only about the English Civil War, the Reformation before that, but millennia of struggles between popes and emperors and kings and bishops, and then popes and emperors before that. Right? Really, the oldest question in the West is the question of where would the lines be between political and religious authority, and to what extent would political authorities tolerate loyalty to God above the state? That's been a dynamic that we've been wrestling with forever. Right? A special patron of mine is St. Thomas Becket, who is the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury in England under King Henry II. And it's funny to look back at that now. His key claim at a time, the so-called Age of Faith, the Middle Ages, he told the king, your power over the church is limited. And as a result, the king says, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? And some guys go and chop off his head. But that claim, that core claim that the power of the state has limits and it doesn't run to the things of God, right? The core claim that there are things that are not Caesar's, to quote Jacques Maritain. That's really the root of the American experiment in religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson, no doubt, would not like me to say that he was indebted to medieval popes, but too bad for him. I can say it anyway, right? But it's true. At least I think it's true. So that's my first superficial point. Our experiment has deep roots. Here's the second one. In addition to looking deeper than the Virginia founders, we want to spread out our vision at the time of the founding. So at the time of the founding, there were a number of different groups, all committed to religious freedom, but who had different ideas about what that would mean in practice. So, Puritans and Congregationalists in New England had a different view than kind of evangelical dissenters in the mid-Atlantic, right? I have an ancestor who was a Baptist preacher in Virginia, a dissenting Baptist from the established church, who was thrown in jail for preaching without a license. Right? That used to be a thing. But he would have thought about what religious freedom means in a different way than Jefferson did. Right? Jefferson and some of his friends were coming at it for more of a kind of Enlightenment philosopher's view. If the microphones weren't on, and of course they weren't because it was the late 18th century, but you know what I mean? If the microphones weren't on, they would have said, we're probably going to outgrow this Christianity thing, but for now it's worth protecting. Right? Jefferson was maybe coming at it from a place more of indifference and toleration. But that's not what the evangelical dissenters were thinking. Right? The movement for American Revolution was just animated pervasively by really powerful religious sentiment. And then you had people, in our book we call them the civic Republicans, people like John Adams and George Washington, who, whatever their own personal piety was, and I tend to think they were more religious than we sometimes give them credit for, they understood that a constitutional republic depended on virtuous citizens, and that you needed religion, they thought, to produce civic virtue. Anyway, my point is, lots of different ways of thinking about what the basis for religious freedom was and what it would mean in practice, even at the time of the founding. No one view. And then here's the third thing. Because I'm a lawyer, me and my friends, we always want to look for the one ring to rule them all, the one principle, the concept that will help us to answer all the questions. If any of you go to law school, I bet some of you will, you'll always be asked, what's the rule in this case? We love that. Okay? The thing about America's experiment in religious freedom is it is not reducible to one principle, one maxim, one rule. So some people will say, well, the key to American religious freedom is separation. Well, no, that's part of the story. Freedom of conscience, that's part of the story. Free exercise, right? The ability to act out your faith through conduct in your real life, that's part of the story. Equality and non-discrimination, that's part of the story as well, right? And the disestablishment, no state religion, that's part of the story. My point is, we don't want to try to reduce the content of America's experiment in religious freedom to any one particular principle. That's myopic. If we do that, we can run astray in some other areas. Okay, so my first principles, my superficial potted history of the West, now comes the real money's worth, my entire First Amendment class in a few minutes. I want to tell you what I see as the 4 basic flavors that American religious freedom disputes come in. In other jurisdictions, if you travel to other parts of the world, they have different kinds of fights than we do, interestingly. We don't have a lot of cases about whether or not you're allowed to wear a hijab in public. We don't have cases about that. Other countries do, right? In other countries, it's a big issue. Are you allowed to wear a crucifix? We don't really have those kind of fights. We have other ones. We have big fights about whether you can take a scholarship to go to a parochial school. Other countries, they don't worry about that at all. Right? So the 4 flavors of religious liberty disputes in our country, they are kind of unique to us. They're part of the American story as well. But I'm going to tell you what they are, and in so doing, I'll be giving you a sense of what some of the Supreme Court's recent decisions have been, and what some of the kind of changes and I think kind of dramatic evolution that we've seen in recent years, evolution that I welcome, but maybe you think otherwise. Here's the first category. These are cases, I call this the cooperation category. Okay? These are cases that involve the relationships between religious institutions, hospitals, schools, soup kitchens, social welfare agencies, right? Refugee resettlement organizations, right? Religious institutions on the one hand and the government on the other. And the question is, when is cooperation permitted? Right? Now, usually cooperation involves money, but it doesn't have to. Right? example of cooperation that's been litigated the most in America has been about money for schools, as many of you probably know. I've spent most of my legal career working in the school choice field, and so most of my legal work has been about trying to make it the case that governments can give money to kids so that they can go to parochial schools. It's been about 35 years. The law has changed a lot in this area. But the point is, you can probably think of other examples, right? Federally funded student loans, Medicare at hospitals, right? You probably read in the news about the government working with various social welfare agencies to fight human trafficking, right? Think of all of these as examples of cooperation. When are they permissible? Well, for a time, well, scratch that. For most of American history, this wasn't controversial. This surprises some of my listeners sometimes, but the government cooperated with religious institutions all the time for most of our history. Why? Because they were the ones doing all the work, right? Schools, most were religious. Hospitals, most were religious. So of course there was cooperation, no big deal. Toward the end of the 1800s and then into the 1900s, as we started seeing the rise of a parochial school system and a lot of Catholic immigrants, our law got nervous, and it tapped into some deeply rooted anti-Catholicism. And the law developed in such a way that the Supreme Court said it violates the separation of church and state for governments to help pay for kids to go to parochial schools. That was the law for about 40 years. There were lots of Supreme Court cases that said this, and there were lots of really funny cases about when you could give aid and when you couldn't. There was one famous case where it was okay to loan books to parochial schools, but it was unconstitutional to give them maps to hang up on the wall, which prompted one judge to say, what do you do with an atlas since it's a book of maps? This is why you go to law school, guys. Okay. For the last 40 years, again, long story short, largely thanks to my old boss, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Supreme Court moved away from that view. Today, the rule is that as long as the government is trying to promote the common good, the secular good, education, healthcare, things like that, it's allowed to cooperate with religious institutions, so long as it doesn't do so in a discriminatory way. So you couldn't have a school voucher program that said, hey, Presbyterians, you can send kids to your schools, but the Methodists can't. You can't do that. But it is now permissible, as a matter of federal constitutional law, for a state to say, we're going to give every kid $5,000 and then go to school wherever they want. And then, one of those judges from 40 years ago kind of raises his head in the grave and says, isn't that a violation of the separation of church and state? And the current court says, no, it's not. It's permissible cooperation. In recent years, one of the most exciting, to my mind, developments in law has been, this is the last couple years, not only is it permissible for governments to cooperate with religious schools, it's now required that religious schools be permitted to participate on an equal playing field level with other non-public entities. So if the government decides it's going to give money to a secular private school, it has to let a religious private school participate as well. This is a recent development. I think it's exciting. Okay, the second flavor. So we had cooperation. The second one is accommodation. Basically, the issue in accommodation cases is when do we let religious people not follow the law? That sounds kind of jarring, I know, but maybe we can say it in a little bit of a nicer way. Are there circumstances where a general law that applies to most people shouldn't be applied to a religious person because that application would really burden the religious person's religious freedom? Right? So the classic example is, going back to the founding, we weren't going to make the Quakers fight in the army because they're pacifist. Right? We accommodated them. Right? And go up, fast forward, centuries, during the Vietnam War, there were lots of conflicts about when we were going to exempt, it was all men from being drafted because of their religious scruples. Now, in our time, we see lots of other accommodations cases, like, what if there's a requirement that to keep your job, you have to get the COVID vaccine, but you have a religious objection to it? What if there's a requirement that you're not allowed to have a hat in your driver's license picture, but you're a Sikh and you want to keep your turban on? actually, speaking of them, what if there's a rule that you can't have any weapons in school, but a young Sikh man is supposed to have a ceremonial dagger inside of his turban? Can we accommodate that? What if there's a rule that says every employer has to provide cost-free contraception to female employees, but the Little Sisters of the Poor, being nuns, don't really want to do that? Right? When do we accommodate people who object to generally applicable laws? For a long time, the answer was we don't. Right? For a long time, the answer was you can ask legislatures to accommodate, but if the legislature decides they want to pass a law, then you have to follow it, or risk going to jail. Okay? Then for a little while in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Supreme Court said, no, you have a constitutional right to be accommodated. If your religious freedom is burdened, if your religious conscience is burdened, you have a right to an exemption unless the government can demonstrate that there's no way to provide one. Then in the early 90s, the Supreme Court said, you know, that's too demanding. That's too inefficient. That's too costly. They went back to the old rule, which was basically legislatures you're allowed to accommodate, but citizens you're not entitled to demand an accommodation. Okay? You guys can see the difference, I bet. Over the course of the last 30 years, what's been happening are two developments in this area. I said flavor, now I'm going to say bucket, so I'm mixing metaphors, forgive me. The two things that have happened is that legislatures have enacted a lot of religious accommodation statutes. So for example, Congress reacted to the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court said, you know what, Native Americans don't have a right to use eagle feathers in their religious ceremonies because eagles are protected. Congress said, well, we're going to accommodate them, actually. So you and I aren't allowed to go and just kill bald eagles. But Native Americans are, in some circumstances, allowed to use bald eagle feathers for religious purposes. Similarly, for some drugs like peyote, some hallucinogenic drugs. Right? These are legislative accommodations, and they've been growing. But the other thing that's happened, most recently in the Supreme Court in the last 5, 6, 7 years, it really picked up during COVID, is that the Supreme Court has said, you know, religious believers aren't entitled to an exemption if the law they object to is truly generally applicable, if it's neutral, if it applies to everyone. But, the Supreme Court said, if the government gives some people an exemption, it has to give it to religious people too. So you guys might not really remember this, but 5 years ago there was this little unpleasant time when like everything got shut down, including churches. Right? And as you might know, in some states the rule was something like churches closed, no gatherings, you know, watch church on TV. Oh, but casinos stay open by all means because we really need the tourist money. There was a lot of unequal treatment going on. In California, churches were closed, Hollywood was open for business. In Nevada, churches were closed, casinos were open for business. Right? So the Supreme Court said, in situations like that, when you are discriminatorily treating religion worse, in situations like that, the religious believers are entitled to an accommodation. So the accommodation category, like the cooperation category, has gotten more interesting in recent years. That's something to keep your eye on. Here's the third category. I'm trying to think of things that end in ION, right? So like cooperation, accommodation. This is expression. Doesn't really rhyme, but same letters, close enough. By expression, I mean religious speech and symbols in the public square. So this could be fights about school prayer, the most famous ones, Bible reading in schools, prayers at school graduation, but also things like, can you put up the 10 Commandments in front of the state capitol? It'd be weird if the answer were no, since the 10 Commandments are actually in the Supreme Court's chamber. That's kind of awkward for the justices considering that issue. You know, if you put up a Christmas tree in front of City Hall, do you also have to put up Santa Claus and 3 reindeer? What about 2 reindeer? Is 1 reindeer enough? Right? If you have a war memorial in a big public park and it's a cross, is that unconstitutional as a, endorsement of Christianity? Or is it okay as long as you have some other memorials that use different? So there was a big case, came out of Maryland a couple years ago, big World War I memorial, about 40 feet high, is a cross. In the newspapers they said it was a memorial that was shaped like a cross. You know what a thing that's shaped like a cross is? It's a cross. So that's what it was. One of the challengers said, this is unconstitutional because it's a religious symbol. It violates the separation of church and state. And I'm not making this up. You'll think that I am. It was seriously argued that it would be okay if they chopped the arms off. Then it wouldn't be a cross anymore, and it would just be a stick, and that would be a permissible war memorial monument. The Supreme Court said, no, you don't have to chop the arms off. But think of other cases like this. Religious symbols in public. Presidents saying, God bless America. National days of prayer. In God we trust on the money. The Madonna and Child on Christmas stamps. All these cases. For almost our entire history, these were not litigated at all. It was accepted that a sort of mild, generic Christian symbology was common in American life, and no one lost any sleep about it. Right? Nobody in the city of Las Cruces or San Bernardino sort of woke up and said, holy crap, this establishment of church and state. Right? They just knew the town was named after San Bernardino. Well, starting with the school prayer cases in the 60s, and then picking up in the 80s with some of these cases about Christmas displays, the Supreme Court spent about 20 years trying to decide whether there was a line that distinguished between religious symbols that are okay and religious symbols that, quote, endorse religion. That was the bad thing. So you have all these cases of judges who would kind of squint, and they would look at religious symbols, and they say, well, here, so Santa Claus is kind of bigger than the creche. So probably everybody who sees it knows that what we're really doing is endorsing generosity and commerce, not Christianity. But if Santa Claus isn't there, people are going to get the wrong idea, and they're going to think you're endorsing the creche. That's bad, unconstitutional endorsement. The court tried this for a while. Recently, they gave up. So there was a case called Kennedy a couple of years ago about a praying football coach. You probably heard about this case. Coach wanted to take a knee and say a prayer after a football game, public school coach. He was disciplined because his school district said, Coach, when you kneel and pray and some of your players are joining you, people who see that, they think that the school district is endorsing your faith. The coach said, no, they don't. They just think that I'm Coach Kennedy and I'm praying. And the Supreme Court said, we're not going to get into this anymore. As long as the government isn't coercing religious expression, we are not going to say that it's unconstitutional for people to express their faith through symbols and speech in the public square. And again, I think this is a development that is welcome and that is correct. You can think of scary cases, or maybe not scary to you, but they're scary to the kind of people who think of cases. Like, what if a town actually did have a sign that said, welcome to South Bend. This city belongs to the Blessed Mother. Now, a lot of us might be like, cool. But you might think that's maybe crossing a line. How is the Supreme Court going to know? Right? It's not coercing anything, but it might well be an endorsement. This is an area, unlike the cooperation category, unlike the accommodation category, where the law isn't quite clear. So stay tuned on that. But you might think for yourselves, remember I said there's no one rule? I said there's a bunch of different principles. Think for yourselves about the principles that you think are at stake and that matter when we're talking about religious freedom and constitutional democracy. And you wanted to give the judge a rule of decision. Here's how you decide when a symbol is okay, and here's how you decide that it's not. What would be the things that you would look for? And if you think of some really good ones, email them to me, and I'll write a law review article about it, and I'll become famous, and I might give you credit. Here's the fourth. So cooperation, accommodation, expression. I'm giving up on the ION thing. The fourth category is autonomy. In my view, this is the least studied but most important category. This is like the original church-state debate, right? Does the king get to pick the bishop, right? Or vice versa, right? Does the bishop get to pick the king? We have developed in our law, and this has been an area that I've tried to do a lot of writing in, but we have developed in the last several decades a healthier appreciation for the fact that religious institutions get to govern themselves. So we're all familiar with the idea that the government in England is going to pick the next Archbishop of Canterbury. The president doesn't get to pick the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. But there are cases that are a little trickier, and I've worked on some of these. Let's say a Catholic school fires a teacher. And the teacher says, "Why'd you fire me?" And the school says, "We fired you because you're a bad Catholic." And then the teacher goes and files a lawsuit because you know what? Employers in America are not allowed to fire you because of your religion, generally speaking. Right? Walmart can't fire you for being a bad Catholic. Why should the Catholic school? And the Supreme Court has said, no, this is actually what the separation of church and state is about. The government doesn't get to pick Catholic school teachers. Right? The government doesn't get to decide, which liturgical prayer should we do on this day, like they did for many centuries in many places. The government doesn't get to say, for example, in a lawsuit where somebody got kicked out of their church for sinning too much. These are real cases, by the way. And they file a tort case against the church and say, "I'm suing you for unlawful church kicking out, and you owe me some money because I miss my friends at the church." People file these, and courts say, that's not a legal standard, right? How are we to know when you get kicked out of a church and when you don't? That's for the church to decide for itself, church autonomy. Right? Churches get to decide for themselves whether they want to be hierarchical, cardinals, bishops, deacons, all that good stuff, or whether they want to be congregational. They get to decide for themselves whether they want to have a celibate clergy or a married clergy. Right? These are matters of church autonomy. This is an area that we didn't focus on very much in American law, in part because I think it was sort of obvious to governments that they shouldn't be meddling in these things. But in recent years, we've seen more of these disputes, again, especially in schools, and I think we're going to keep seeing them. This, for me, is, like I said earlier, the category of cases that takes us deepest back into history. Right? We didn't used to worry about religious symbols in public, but we did always have this sense, again, quoting Jacques Maritain, that there were some things that aren't Caesar's. Give to God what is God's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Finding that line, that's what the autonomy category is about. Okay, so big first principles, prior commitments, biases maybe. Quick history of the West, all of Supreme Court law. You guys are really getting your money's worth. It's only been 40 minutes. I want to end with 4 challenges to America's religious freedom experiment. They're related, but I think they're distinguishable. So here's the first. The sociologists like to call this, in quotes, the rise of the nuns. And they don't mean the kind of cute kind. They mean N-O-N-E-S. Okay? My daughter's a nun. I'm allowed to say that. The rise of the nuns is a sociologist term for more and more people, if you ask them, what's your religious affiliation? They say none. It doesn't mean they don't believe in God. A lot of these people pray a lot. They're very spiritual. They're spiritual but not religious. But they're disaffiliated. They don't belong to a tradition, a congregation, an institution. So this rise of the nuns development is problematic in my view for 2 reasons. The first is that it causes religious institutions to be weaker, causes religious communities to be weaker. And if you've read any Tocqueville, you know that's dangerous. Right? That a healthy system of protecting individual rights depends on a civil society that includes lots of healthy institutions. And the worry that I have, this is why I'm putting this as kind of like a challenge that we're facing, is that if disaffiliation continues, people become spiritual but not religious, then we won't have strong institutions that can kind of stand kind of as safeguards against the state. The second reason why this is problematic, and then this becomes my second challenge, is that it's not a good thing if religious freedom starts to be regarded as kind of a quirky luxury good. It's better in public policy if a whole lot of people have a stake in something, then that thing is more likely to be secure. Right? You study any economics, obviously you know this. Religious freedom is going to be more vulnerable if it's seen as something just kind of quirky and self-interested that a few people care about. Right? If a lot of people come to think they don't have a stake in it. Now the problem is people don't realize it, but we all have a stake in religious freedom, whether we're religious or not. This is a really core claim of mine, that even if you never darken the door of a religious congregation, it is in your best interest, if you care about your liberty, it's in your best interest that you live under a government that respects religious freedom. Because a government that respects religious freedom is one that's willing to say, there are some things that are higher than us. And I don't know about you, but I prefer, all things being equal, a government that says there is something higher than us to a government that says, no, there's nothing higher than us. A government that respects religious freedom is more likely to respect other freedoms, and a government that doesn't care about religious freedom is one that's less likely to care about other freedoms. Here's what I see as a third challenge. This is, it's the polarization and the partisanizing of the religious freedom question. It wasn't always this way. Right? It didn't used to be the case that in Supreme Court cases about religious freedom or church-state relations, that the lines ended up being kind of those who were appointed by one president versus those who were appointed by another. It didn't used to be that our major political parties had dramatically different views about the importance of religion in public life, right? Or about the importance of religious freedom. Okay? We are seeing more of a kind of segmentation in terms of our partisan politics on that issue. So I think some people, when they hear religious freedom, they think, oh, that's a partisan issue for that team. My team doesn't like that. That's a mistake. Now, I don't want to overstate that because a lot of people, I mean, the newspapers don't always tell you this. A lot of our Supreme Court religious freedom cases are 9-0. Right? The case I told you about the Catholic school teachers, 9-0. A case a couple years ago about a Muslim prisoner who was growing a beard, and the prison people wanted him to shave it. He said, no, I mean, let me grow a short beard like mine, basically. And 9-0, yeah, he has a right to that. So I don't want you to go out of here thinking like, oh, the Supreme Court is just divided red versus blue on religious freedom. That's not always true. But I think in our political discourse, it often seems like it's true, and I feel like it's trending more in that way. And here is the final challenge, and I'll be ending here in just a second. The fourth challenge is the confusion about the word secular. A lot of people think that secular means anti-religious. And so they say, well, I'm secular, that means I'm anti-religious. That's a misunderstanding, and especially those of you who are Catholic know this, because that word is deeply embedded in our tradition. We talk about secular clergy. Right? Secular doesn't mean anti-religious. It's just a recognition that this side of heaven, there are some things that belong appropriately to the political authorities, like the speed limit, and there are some things that belong appropriately to the religious authorities. And the word secular, correctly understood, is, as the late Pope Benedict would always put it, it's a healthy secularity. Secular should not connote church versus state. It just recognizes that we have church and state. And there's plenty of room. He always said this, and he especially liked to lecture the French about this, because they have kind of an obsessive secularity. Secularism, he would say. He would say, secularity need not be secularism. Don't make an ism out of it. Just recognize that you can have these two distinct kinds of authorities that cooperate. So just to wrap up, 30-something years ago, when he was signing the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, then President Bill Clinton said that religious freedom is the first freedom. And some people kind of teased him about that because, oh, you're saying that because it's in the First Amendment, and don't you know that the First Amendment wasn't really first at the beginning, it was really third? Gotcha. Whatever. It's the first freedom for this reason, that it's foundational, right? That it is structural. That, as I said at the very beginning, our Constitution at its heart is about structuring power in ways that protect freedom. We do that with the separation of powers, we do that with federalism, and I'd like to suggest to you that we should think of religious freedom as being yet another way in which, by separating powers, right, some things are Caesar's, some things are God's, we provide protection to the things that really matter, namely the things of God. So, thank you, and I